Everyone. I'm Tom Roberts, the Director of Vendor Programs for the PSNI Global Alliance. I'm here along with Haley Klein, our Communications and Marketing Director at PSNI. The PSNI Global Alliance represents over 108 certified service providers in 61 countries worldwide. Williams AV has been a tremendous help in our mission to provide quality customer service. Designing hearing loop systems always requires true collaboration between all stakeholders involved in a project. Williams AV specializes in the development of technologies and support services to help in creating seamless experiences for individuals with hearing impairments. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy will be provided to you. We do encourage you to participate in the conversation, so please ask questions. Quite frankly, that's how we all learn. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can in real time and follow up with those when we run out of time. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Tony Braun, Vice President of Global Sales and Marketing at Williams AV. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to come back and address the PSNI broader audience. As Tom said, I have the distinct pleasure of leading the sales and marketing team. So it's a talented collection of folks who can provide a number of resources, both pre and post sale, a lot of experience in loops. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can use the resources of our team at the conclusion of the webinar today. We try to focus the webinars that we have the opportunity to deliver really on educational pieces. Nobody wants to log in and hear specifically a commercial about gear. What we try to do with our sessions is really focus on best practices, things to consider when implementing a particular technology to make sure that it is a full success. So in order to do that, we've invited two very special guests. Both of these individuals have been authorized resellers or distributors for Williams for many years. And more than that, they're trusted advisors. They've provided us great feedback to help us not only support the customers that put our products in, but also to provide us feedback on how to make those products better and what that experience really is for people. So I want to take just a second to introduce both of my special guests. I'll start with Richard. Richard Fontaine is a product manager and has done many loops with Ericsson Commercial, which is a division of Exertis and Jam. Deep experience from Richard across all different kinds of assistive listening systems. And he's not only been on the front end of these projects, but on the back end. So welcome, Richard. Appreciate you having us or joining us today. And then next is Tony Rendle. Tony has been a friend of Williams for many years and has a kind of a unique story to tell. Tony has implemented, has worked with different integrators here, mainly in the Midwest, but has been an advisor to us because Tony has his own form of hearing loss that he'll talk about here in a little bit, and can really speak to what that experience is for someone with hearing loss, and the difference that a well designed, implemented, commissioned, and maintained hearing loop system can really do for the audience. So again, welcome, Tony. Tony's logging in today from his phone because his computer decided to throw him a curveball. So like any good tech man, he's improvised and is logging in from his phone today. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So with that, I will kind of jump right in here. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and we're just going to have a conversation today so I can ask some questions of these two experienced folks that hopefully everybody can benefit from. So Tony, I'm going to start with you if I can. Again, thanks for being here. And can you talk to the audience a little bit? They may have seen a couple of details on the slide I just put up, but talk a little bit about your personal hearing.
Yeah, so it's a military related hearing loss, and it was damage to the actual eardrums. So the hearing cochlear bones work great, but the eardrums themselves over the years continue to scar over and fail. And about 8-9 years ago. They rapidly failed, and I lost 90% in one ear and 75% in the other ear. So I've had to have a surgically implanted hearing assistive device or hearing aid that's called a cochlear Baja, and that's how I hear now.
Excellent. And how long ago was that, Tony?
I've had this. This is the new technology. I've had this for 5 years.
Okay, excellent. And one of the reasons we wanted Tony to join is, again, we don't want to just talk about gear for gear's sake and the bits and bytes of putting this stuff in, but Tony had shared with me when we first met 4 or 5 years ago at Infocom, your story really hit home for me. And can you, for the folks that maybe don't have hearing loss or have never been part of a loop implementation, or really understand what the benefit is, can you talk about what it's like for you when you go into a venue that either doesn't have a loop system or any kind of an assistive listening system, but may have a very well designed and deployed public address system with speaker arrays and DSP and all the other things that we put in to create a great experience in these venues? What is that like for someone with a hearing situation like yours?
It's very frustrating. The reality is the hearing aid does an amazing job picking up audio. So in most cases, you can walk into a space, and if it's just one person talking at the front of the room, the hearing aid zeroes in on that person, just like microphone arrays that we have in conference rooms and everything. The bad part is it is a great microphone and it picks up everything in the room. So if someone's crinkling papers in the background, clicking a pen, moving around, you get someone that's bouncing their leg and their chair squeaks, I'm hearing that over presenters or over what I'm trying to pay attention to. Our brains naturally with our normal hearing can block those sounds out. But when you have a hearing aid, it doesn't know what it's trying to pick up. So it picks up everything in the room. So a good listening hearing loop system or Wi-Fi system is great because I can mute the microphone that's on the outside of the hearing aid and focus on what's being brought to me via T-Coil or via Wi-Fi through my phone.
Awesome. Can you talk a little bit about, I'm going a little off script here, Tony, but when you've been involved in working with Williams Systems and our Digi-Loop products and other offerings, I know you've done a number of assisted living facilities and others. Can you talk about your experience when you go into a looped area, what that really means, how you know a loop is available in a space, and is there anything that you need to do on your end as a user to take advantage of the loop space?
So my particular hearing aid, because it's a surgically implanted one, runs off of my phone. People who have over-the-ear hearing aids, they have a switch on their hearing aid that as they walk in, if they know there's a hearing loop system, they switch it to T-Coil or they switch it to Wi-Fi, and then they can run it through their phone that way to pick up signals. Mostly, obviously, it's signage is the way I know that there's hearing systems. With Williams, it's pretty nice because my app, if I walk into a space and I'm having a hard time, I can go to my app and it tells me that there's a system that's within range that'll work. And then I just click on that room and life is good. The hearing loops themselves, unless they say it, the only way I know is I turn my T-Coil on and I just start hearing. So not a lot of places have it, and I wish they would, because more and more people are becoming hearing impaired. So I, as an advocate for hearing and an AV integrator, I try to express the value of that to people, because more and more people are having hearing issues now as we get older.
Yeah, when you look at the statistics, you brought up a great point here that this is a growing challenge. The statistics we see, depending on how you look at, are continuing to increase, or at least hearing loss at a measurable level is setting in sooner. So to use the most recent statistic I have, more than 15% of adults in the US, similar statistics outside the US, have hearing loss that makes that level of participation or engagement in a space difficult. And in participation at recent hearing aid conferences, called Hear Tech. We're hearing that hearing loss based on prolonged exposure and the earbud generation, those forms of hearing loss are actually setting in sooner. So this is a growing problem. And it's something that is just really well addressed with loops. Some people may think loop is older technology, but like anything else, televisions have been around a long time too, but they, look at the difference in what we experience today versus what we did many years ago. Loop technology has, with more powerful amplifiers, network control and monitoring, Dante inputs, lots of enhancements to loops that make them still a great option for providing an assistive listening system. So, Tony, thanks for sharing your own story a bit there and the difference that this makes. I always like to put that context around why are we putting this gear in, and share that we would never, as AV designers, put in equipment that only addressed 85% of our audience, right? We want a perfect experience. But if we don't address those with hearing loss in the room, that's really what we're doing, is addressing 85% of our audience, if not less than that. So what we thought would be helpful for the group, now that we kind of understand the context of what the real benefit is here, is to ask questions of both of you about your extensive experience in seeing different venues, looking at which venues would be good candidates for a hearing loop, the things that go through your mind as you consider whether or not hearing loop or other technology is the best approach. So I've got a handful of questions that I'd like to bounce back and forth between the two of you, so that they can everybody else on the call today can benefit from your experience. So Richard, let me start with you. When you get contacted by a venue or through a partner that says, hey, we really think we want to put in a hearing loop, what are the first things that go to your mind? Where do you start in terms of asking questions or starting to scope that opportunity?
Well, thank you, Tony. Well, the first thing I have to say is that every case is unique. So it's important to really qualify the job that needs to be done, the location, and the area that needs to be covered. So the first question that will come to mind in such a case is what kind of venue it is, what type of room, what is it used for, how large it is. And we usually suggest that our partner integrator does a site survey to go verify a couple of things on site. Just so we know which way to go and how to design the system.
Right. Tony, anything you would add to that in terms of when you've taken that same call? I mean, the size and scope of the room, how it's used is very important. Anything else you'd add to Richard's comments?
No, the only thing I would encourage is the vault of the space. If it has a vaulted ceiling, that creates a lot of echoing with hearing aids, and that really drives even a bigger need. Big rooms, if they have a flat roof or flat ceiling, aren't as big of an issue, but if they have a vault, it can really create feedback issues for a hearing aid. Gotcha.
I failed to mention up front here that we'll bounce back and forth with some of these questions between Tony and Richard here to tap into their expertise. And then we'll take some time at the end of this. We'll try to leave 10 or 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. I do see a few rolling into the Q&A down on the bottom. So please keep those coming, and we'll circle back around on any of those that we don't answer throughout the course of the session a little bit later here. So Richard, back to you. You talked about being able to do a site survey. Not always possible, right? If we're talking about something that's under construction or a major renovation, that sometimes can be a little harder to get access to the space. But what I think I heard you say is if you have access to the space, it would be a good idea to do that. So talk about the importance of a site survey and what you and your team would look for when you go in.
Well, the main things to look for when you go in is the type of flooring, because we need to set the cables under the flooring in most cases. So we need to know what type of flooring we have in the space. do some tests to see if there's any electromagnetic background noise that could interfere with the loop system. Do a little metal loss test in the place, if it's partially up or if it's a retrofit, to know, are we going to have to take this into consideration when we do design the system? So these are the main things that we look for. Need to know the amplifier location. We need to know, and that comes back to a little bit of what Tony was saying. What type of source are we going to use? What type of mics? Where are the mics going to be located? Because the loop system will perform as best as it could, given the source we're feeding it to it. So if the microphone is not placed properly, we're not using the right type of microphone for the audio system, we're going to pick up a lot of background noise with a vaulted ceiling, a lot of echo. So it's important to have the mic as close from the talker as possible. So these are all little things we're going to take care of and we're going to look at during the site survey that will help us orient the design and the spec of the work to be done.
Yeah, so if I can piggyback on the back of that, going off script a little bit here for you guys. You talked about the importance of looking or examining for other electromagnetic interference or EMI that could get in the way, doing some tests to determine the construction material and whether or not metal loss will play a factor. For those who don't know, rebar, steel pan decking, any metal within the context of the venue is the enemy of a loop system. It draws some of that electromagnetic energy carrying the audio signal away from it, and there's ways to compensate for it, but it's important that we know. So Richard, when you go into a space or your team goes into a space, talk about the equipment you use, or how do you determine the construction materials, the amount of metal loss, any other EMI that might be happening in the space. How do you do that?
Well, one of the great tool our installers are using is one of the Williams AV unit, the PLM FSMP, which is a field strength meter that can be used to test for these type of electromagnetic interference and run some metal loss tests as well. Good.
So Tony, you've walked into all kinds of different environments to consider whether or not a loop would be helpful. What are some of the other things that you look for in the spaces? How do you look at doing a site survey?
For me, I look at the transition to the floors, if they're going from tile to carpet. During those transitional times, that's a huge point of failure. With carpet layers and with tile layers, they have a tendency to try and cut through our stuff. Even with it marking, one of the big things I do is just try and, when we do the loops, try and avoid transitionals as much as possible. It's not always possible, but right. And looking at where, like in church settings, where they're going to be bolting furniture back down. That's a big one, to make sure that we try and stay clear of that and make the client aware that what they're doing onto the floor could affect the outcome of the use. So that's otherwise he pretty much covered the rest of it pretty well.
Excellent. Well, it's clear that you've done a lot of these, because when I say what are the factors to consider, you're just rattling them right off, right? I mean, it's like second nature, but there might be a number of people on this call that have only done a loop or two. Sometimes they go well, sometimes there's a lot of learning experiences in those. So do you have any kind of a checklist, or these things that come to mind for you automatically? There was a lot of detail in there. So do you have any type of checklists that you use so that when you walk in to do that site survey, or you sit down with that venue to say, hey, you're interested in a loop, that you make sure you address all these things, or how do you do it?
Well, I do have myself a checklist that I run through with my integration partner, because I don't do the work myself. I work with a network of integrators in Canada, and I have a checklist that I go through with them and telling them what they need to look for, what they need to get the information we need, what it is exactly. And it's based on one of the forms that the wonderful people from the Tech Blue team at Williams AV have put together. I'm using this as a model. And
yeah, thanks for the plug. I expected to put it in a little bit later, but for those that might not be aware or have worked with Williams before, we have a very talented group of people that have been integrators They provide support to any of those who work with us on the front end or the back end. And so a little bit later in the session, we'll point you towards a resource here that provides some best practices. So I'll add to that later, but know that our Tech Blue team, think Geek Squad on steroids. Well, no disrespect to the Geek Squad, but they're guys who have lived in the bowels of many different projects and knows what some of the gotchas are, and we're here to support you in that. So let's talk a little bit about, okay, we've done a site survey, or we've collected as much information as we can about a space. And if you're new to this, and you go to the Williams AV website or any of the other loop manufacturers, hearing loop manufacturers, and you click, all of a sudden you see lots of different models of loop amplifiers. Talk a little bit, maybe Tony, I can start with you this time. What are some of the key considerations that go in for you, or what do you think about when you try to say, well, I got to pick the right loop amplifier for this space, and what considerations go into that?
Just mostly the number of zones, number of loop zones. And for me, also the distance, the amount of loop wire that's going to be used, obviously are big ones. There's going to be some loss on that. But again, to give Williams a nice plug, the engineers that help with this do a great job with that also. They narrow down the categories really, really well for you.
Yep. Yep. Anything you'd add to that, Richard? Not looking for another plug here, but anything else relative?
No, it's basically the area of coverage, like Tony mentioned. The amount of cable we're going to use will have an effect because there's a loss in the cable. How far we need to cover, the size of the place will pretty much give us which model of amp to use for a particular project.
Yeah. One thing I'll add that I've heard from many of our integrators, when you're considering a space, what's easy to overlook sometimes is when you're so focused on a space, the height of the ceilings, the construction material, what microphones are in use, other potential sources of interference, right? There's a big, piece of electrical equipment immediately behind the room, is to consider the context of not just the room, but what's next to that room. We've done a number of courthouses where you have to consider what is above and below the room as well, because those can all be sources of interference, or if you're putting loops in many adjacent spaces, there's some considerations that go into that as well. So, I've always said we learn the most from the things we do wrong. I've got a few scars to prove it over the years of my career, but can you talk about any oversights, or I dare call them mistakes, that things that you didn't think about, or planning mistakes, common installation issues when you did your first few loops, things that, boy, I didn't think about that, and it had the potential to come back and bite me. So, Tony, any horror stories or any lessons learned from some of the early days of doing loops that you would warn other integrators about?
There was one project in particular that we had an absolute horror story on. The flooring people came in and cut our loops, and probably we stopped counting at 20 spots they cut it. And the whole floor had to come up and the whole thing had to be redone. I think one of the lessons we learned from that was the flooring guys usually come in on one day and do their floors. And that is to have an installer on site to point out where to be careful. Even though we use the big orange tape and we spray paint around the areas, and we try and make it as very obvious as possible, those guys just have really sharp knives and they just go ripping right through that stuff. And you can only have so many of those joints repaired before you really compromise the loop. Like I said, at 20, we stopped counting and said, we have to replace this whole thing. The whole thing's been compromised. So that was one of the big lessons for us, was to try or to make sure we have a installer on site the day the floor goes into that space.
Yep. While it's not ideal to have another day on site, build it into your time, into your project cost to have them there, because the potential risks that you avoid by having somebody there certainly pays for itself versus pulling out all the flooring. So Richard, any other gotchas in early projects that come to mind that you'd like to warn other integrators about?
Well, the only one I can think of is you talked about adjacent rooms with the overspill from one loop to the other. Forgot to take into consideration that it's vertical as well as horizontal. So 2 floors, one on top of the other, one loop will interfere with the other, will spill into the other room, and that caused us a little bit of headaches.
Yeah, and then what would that, if there's that overspill or that, what does that sound like for somebody wearing a hearing aid, Tony?
I've never come across that. So I would imagine that either both loops induce onto the T-Coil, or the stronger one comes in and the other one just sounds like something in the background, because it's just how it picks up the induction. So I've never come across that. Fortunately, everybody's always been really good integrators.
Good. Well, that's a good. We've heard of that coming up a few times, as Richard indicated, and what we hear is you get a bleed. So you're sitting in and you're getting a signal, and in most cases you can start to hear the audio from the other space as well, and it just makes it more difficult to engage and enjoy that experience. So Tony, one thing I've heard, and I don't know if you use this trick, Richard, is in large spaces, there can be quite a bit of wire that goes down, flat copper in a phased array pattern. And it can be tough to see as the carpet installers or the flooring installers are moving quickly. One tip that we've provided and we've heard as a good practice is to use a continuity tester. So to be able to connect something to either end of the loop, which should have continuity throughout, and if the wire does get cut in some way, despite all of the precautions that are taken, this will generate a very loud noise to say that continuity has been lost. Have either of you used a tool like that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
As I said, I don't do the work myself. I help people to do it, but I've heard about it. Yes, it's one good trick to use a continuity tester before making the final connection to make sure your loop wire is good.
Yep. So pretty affordable pieces. You can buy them on Amazon, and just a continuity alarm is a great tool. We've had horror stories that, like you shared, Tony, where the carpet, the installers come in, they start cutting. And when that happens and you have multiple breaks in the line, it's very difficult to start tracing them. In your case, you said you had to scrap it and go all back through everything altogether. But there's tracing equipment that can be used, but basically you're finding the first break and repairing it, and then starting over to find where the next break is, and so on. So if there's any one thing that I think you take out of this webinar, is take great care to label the wire as it goes down, that it is cannot be cut, that it's part of the assistive listening system for the space, and do everything within your power to protect and inspect as the flooring goes in. So that's a great recommendation. What recommendations do you have for integrators that are connecting these loop systems with other equipment in a venue? What have you found? What can you talk about the placement of the amplifier and that's importance on the performance of the loop? So Tony, maybe I'll start with you on that one.
Usually the amplifiers just sit right in the rack with the equipment. Pretty much everything can go into it. If you've got a good DSP, just program the DSP to just kick out a signal to it all the time. That way obviously anything that's being displayed or any microphone that's being used just works. You don't have to worry about it. The trick to it a little bit is just because sometimes these racks aren't close. They're, they could be, few, 50, 60, 70 yards away in IDFs or MDFs. And you're normally going to run a larger gauge wire to the connection point where you start your loops. So that's kind of one of the only kickers to it.
Yep. Anything to add to that, Richard?
Nothing else to add. He covered everything.
Yep. So again, we think about the space and the materials and picking the right amp. The placement of the amp can also play a factor, because oftentimes we'll hear someone who hasn't really considered or communicated with our team who's helping to provide the design, the length of the lead wires that go from the amplifier itself into that space. So another one of those considerations to put on the checklist and make sure is communicated between the venue and those who are installing the system. Any particular equipment that you use? Are you using analog signals, Dante inputs, all of the above? Any particular preferred configurations in terms of what each of you recommend in each situation?
Well, I would say
go ahead.
Go. I would say the best connection as possible. If you have Dante in your rack, then by all means, we've got some Digi-Loop amps from Williams that have Dante inputs and can be used with the Dante signal. If you don't have a Dante network installed on site, yeah, well, then regular balanced audio input will do the trick.
Yep, good. Tony?
And I'll say, if at all possible, go Dante. There is a sound quality difference in the loop. The Dante seems to be have a little bit more realistic sound to it, whereas the analog is a little tinnier. There's a little bit more top end to it to the analog side. So if you can do Dante, just from a nice perspective of the user, try and go that route. Got
it. Thank you. Want to talk a little bit about coverage. So we talked about picking the right amplifier and tapping into some of the resources in the Tech Blue team, but there are particular standards. There's an IEC standard, 60118-4, and that standard speaks to coverage and the consistency of coverage. Either of you want to share thoughts on that standard and what it means to meet that standard?
Well, I'll kick this one off. The standard is wonderful, but regardless, you're going to have hot zones and cold zones for your hearing loop, where some are going to just sound better than others. I think even when all things done perfect, you're still going to have variances between the loops a little bit. And it's also going to depend on the equipment that the user has, their hearing aid quality. Right. You're, like I said, it's great to have standards, but you're going to find that one of the biggest factors is going to be something you can't control, and that's what the person has for their personal device. Yep.
Richard, thoughts on that one?
Well, on that, it's important to have a good floor plan of the space to be covered, to know exactly what are the obstacles in the way, what type of material we have around that room and in the floor, and then rely on the wonderful people at Tech Blue to provide us with a design that provide us as even a coverage as possible for any given space.
Yeah. So for those who are not familiar with the standard, there'll be more detail in the design best practices guide that I'll share in just a few minutes here. But what that IEC standard says is that we're trying to create an even coverage across the space, so that if we're using that field strength meter, or if all else was equal, and Tony, you make a great point that you really can't control the type or quality of devices that come into an area, but the standard, or the goal of the standard, is that if all of those things are considered equal, that you would be able to move across that entire space, and there wouldn't be, if we can overcome any of the challenges in the room, that there wouldn't be more than a plus or minus 3 dB variance across that space. So that is what the standard is, and that is at a listening plane. So we're all seated today. If that's the way the space is going to be used, you want that listening plane to be at a level where they're seated. And that goes to some of your points earlier, Richard, about it's important to understand how the space is going to be used. If we're designing it for a coverage level where people are generally seated, now if we're standing or you've got vaulted ceilings, that really changes that listening plane. So good feedback on that one as well. Talk talk a little bit about, so let's say we've done our jobs, right? We've picked the right amp, we've put the wire down in the right configuration to try and provide a nice even listening plane. So then the flooring is in. Now we're to the point where we're post install. Talk a little bit about the commissioning process. What should an integrator plan on beyond just getting the wire down on the floor and making all the connections? How do you get this thing configured, or what we'll call commissioned properly? How much time should they spend? What are the steps in commissioning a loop amplifier?
You want to start, Tony, or?
You can.
Okay, well, post-install, the steps are turn on the system, do a walkthrough with the customer, using either a loop receiver or the field strength meter we talked about earlier, and just walk through the room and see the level of signal that we're getting. This test, it's important to be done to make sure everything is running up to par when we commission the system at first. And it's also important to run some tests, I'd say once a year, to make sure that the system keeps on operating the way it should.
Yep. Anything to add, Tony?
I think to add to that would be make sure you focus on whatever input, if there's multiple inputs going into the amp, that everything is even, so you don't have microphones loud and presentation programming down quiet or vice versa. I think that's the only other thing, is just making sure all your levels going in are even. You're gonna, obviously there's gonna be some microphone issues because some people are gonna be soft talkers versus loud talkers, but just the best you can to keep all those inputs on the exact same level of input.
Nice. The good guidance on that one. How about once it's in and we've now received sign off from our client that says, yep, it's in, it's performing as expected. We have happy audiences. The signage is up. That's a very important step that's sometimes overlooked, but a requirement of most disability legislation is that there's some form of signage instructing people that there is a hearing loop available. That is, at least in the US, commonly indicated by an ear-shaped symbol, which is the general signage for that an assistive listening system is available. But when a hearing loop is, there's also a T shape on that same sign to indicate people could use their T-Coil to receive that signal. So good thought on that one. One of the things I'll say in terms of the advancements in loop amplifiers, back in the day, you were commissioning a large space. The installer, or sometimes more than one installer, had to be sent, so that you had someone taking readings from the space, relaying those readings back to the person where the amplifier was located, making adjustments and trying to see how that worked. So either one person running back and forth over and over and over to try and make sure the levels were right and even across that listening plane, or sending two people. One of the advancements or recommendations that I would have for people is look for those, if it's a larger space, smaller rooms, such as the one I'm in, and a perimeter loop serves fine, not necessary, but in a larger space, look for amplifiers that have a network control capability, a remote adjustment capability. We use a PC-based app, so someone with that PC walking that space connected to the same network as the amplifier can take the readings and be able to make adjustments as they walk the space, rather than more time on site to be running back and forth between the space and the amplifier to make adjustments. So just another a best practice or recommendation I would throw out. Do either of you have thoughts on how frequently you would test a hearing loop system? So we've got sign off, everything's in good shape. You leave it in a good state, but we want to make sure that that isn't just working at the moment we walk out the door and provide our invoice, but also that experience remains as good over time. So any thoughts on how often a venue, or how often should test, or how often an integrator who's maybe providing some ongoing services to that venue should test the loop?
Well, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we recommend testing it at least once a year.
Okay. Annually, yep. Is
Yeah.
that a regulation across Canada, Richard, or more your recommendation?
It's a best practice. It's not a regulation.
Okay. How about you, Tony? Any other thoughts?
I would agree with that. Ideally, you can sell a maintenance contract and go in and I would always say that after the first few uses, you go back and check the system and make sure everything's working properly. But once a year is pretty good, unless you obviously get a phone call in the meantime.
Yeah, of course. And then again, some of the advancements are the ability to, if you're providing some managed services for that venue, the network controlled amplifiers, as long as you have access to that IP address, would allow you to log in and do anything from a web interface that you could do from the front panel. So again, that could be a great tool for someone providing managed services to a venue. So again, going a little off script here, guys, a most memorable loop story, Richard, hopefully a positive one where you got some feedback after putting in a loop and the difference that it made. I'm putting these guys on the spot a little bit, but a favorite loop story to relay?
There's one that comes to mind where we did a system in a retirement home for it was more like a large living room, TV room, and the committee of the residents actually sent us a thank you note for putting them up to that system, because they were now able to hear the movies, hear the people that was talking in front of the room, something they weren't able to before.
Right.
Always a little warm to the heart when you get some letters like this.
Yep, it can make a difference. How about you, Tony? A favorite story?
It was an accident. I happened to go to a church and was using their hearing loop system and was getting a buzz, a really bad buzz. And I happened to mention it I went after we were done there, for the reason why we were there, I went back to the person who was running the soundboard and I explained it to him. They hired our company to come in and find out why there's a buzz. And we found out pretty quick what it was. They had switched out their lighting with LEDs, and the LEDs were causing problems with the loop system. After that was fixed, the response was how many people were using it that they didn't realize, because so many people came up to them afterwards and said, I don't know what you did, but all of a sudden I can hear them better, because there was a buzz always and I didn't want to say anything. And they found out that a very large number of their parish was actually using the loop system and they didn't realize it.
Yep. How about the most common? So I've heard you say house of worships, talked a little bit about maybe assisted living or retirement communities. What are some of the other types of venues that you've both installed hearing loops into, or where would you point another fellow integrator who's looking to say, hey, I think we have the right tools and resources to install loops? What market segments should they look at? Where have you been most successful? I'll start with you, Tony.
Any public venue, whether it's conferencing spaces or churches, school auditoriums, all of those things are gonna be great uses for hearing loop systems and for assistive listening systems. So you're not going to see it as much in the corporate settings, but definitely in public settings like schools, auditoriums, churches. Senior housing, it falls into place pretty well because they have large meeting areas for monthly bingo or weekly bingo or whatever they do. So those are prime for that type of system. But basically anything public that uses the microphone, it could benefit from these systems.
Yep, got it. Any others that come to mind for you, Richard?
Well, as he said, many public spaces, so rec centers, churches, school auditoriums, that type of venues has always been the first one to comes to mind when we think about place where we can set up a loop system.
Yeah, here at Williams, we're seeing a couple others as well. So courtrooms, there is, it's just the nature of the beast that a lot of judges are at a stage of life where they're experiencing hearing loss. So we're seeing many projects where we're looping the judge's bench, or maybe the where the jurors reside as well. And we've done many airports, including Memphis, Grand Rapids. The Minneapolis airport has been looped extensively. Government facilities, hearing rooms, council chambers, anything like that. Again, kind of all covered under that public spaces that Tony mentioned. But those are some of the more frequent requests that we get in addition to what each of you mentioned. So if you work in any of those spaces, again, just based on the genuine benefit people get from this technology, those would be areas to look for, and just start looking for the signage of whether or not they have a hearing loop system or any kind of assistive listening system in place. So we have, we're at about we got about 15 minutes left. I'll have just 2 minutes of wrap up at the end. I'm gonna see if we have any specific questions that we can field here. Yes, there will be a recording after. Can either of you speak to about loop versus Wi-Fi? So the experience of using a loop that directly communicates to a hearing aid or a cochlear implant versus somebody streaming the audio from through Wi-Fi through their phone and then Bluetooth to a device. Either of you want to comment on that one?
Well, maybe Tony could go, since he's been using both technology himself. So
there is advantages and disadvantages of the Wi-Fi portion of it. The biggest problem is not every single hearing aid out there is capable of working with Wi-Fi, but every single hearing aid out there is capable with a T-Coil. So the loop systems will hit a larger percentage of people. The Wi-Fi systems are great if you're savvy with your phone. And I think what you're going to find, though, especially with the older generations, they're still a little reluctant to use the systems because they feel like it makes them look a little different. So pulling their phone out, searching for the Wi-Fi, connecting to it, turning their app on, all that sometimes is a little bit too much work and they won't do it. So the loop systems are just so much easier. It's the flick of a switch.
Yeah, there's certainly some education that takes place. We do a number of events to try and remind or make sure that audiologists, as they fit their clients with various hearing devices, that they educate them on how to make use of that. We have some good friends at Starkey right down the road, and I know that virtually or the vast majority of their products have a T-Coil included or an accessory device that works with the hearing aid that has a T-Coil included. So it is can be less intimidating for a certain audience as opposed to having to understand how to use all of those elements of your phone. The other thing to consider relative to the strength of the network, the age of the phone, and the Bluetooth connection between a phone and an earpiece is latency. So when you talked about some of the variables, Tony, of you don't really know exactly what equipment people are going to be bringing in, I would say that there's as much, if not more, variances in the types of phones, Bluetooth devices, and Wi-Fi connections in a venue that can potentially impact latency. So again, consider the venue and the audience before you go down the Wi-Fi route. Can be a great technology. We're putting in more of that than we ever have, but it really needs to be the right venue and the right audience for that. Couple more questions here. Thanks to those who've submitted the questions. Can a loop be fed in the ceiling, or do you only do floor installations? Can you, thank you for the question, Carol. Tony or Richard, you want to talk about ceiling loops?
Well, ceiling loops can be done in certain cases, but it's not the recommended placement. Depends what type of ceiling you're using. If it's a suspended ceiling with metal grid, forget it. It's not compatible with a loop system.
Yeah, so the metal grid or in a suspended ceiling is metal, right? So it is the enemy. And usually, depending on the height of the ceilings, it changes the listening plane. So you'd have to bring that listening plane down quite a bit, requiring more power. Tony, any thoughts on any other thoughts on ceiling loops?
The exact same reason. In addition to the grid, you have ventilation ducts, you have electrical wires, not so much copper for plumbing anymore, but there's a lot up there that can interfere with it. So it's not just best practice. It's the most reliable practice is to stay with the floor.
Yep. How about other options? We've talked about a little bit about perimeter loops and about phased array loops. Are either of you involved much in doing counter loops or installing loops in any type of furniture within a room?
We've done many of those counter loop installed under the counter, under the table. Or as you mentioned before, when you were talking about the courtrooms, for a certain area of a room to be looped with a smaller loop system, we've done many of those, and it's something that can easily be done in pretty much any type of welcome counters, information desks, ticket booth, that kind of thing.
Yep, and there's different options for there. Something that can be nicely concealed under the counter, under the surface, no larger than a bar of soap with a wire hidden nicely, or for even a more portable option, things that you can set right on the counter and connect a microphone to, and requires little to no installation, but another opportunity anytime where there's a service counter. So I'm going to field a question here quick from Donald. He's just asking a little bit about how Williams loop drivers compare to other manufacturers. So Williams has announced, and we've been marketing something called our Digi-Loop series of amplifiers. We've been selling those globally since 2013, and they've seen a number of enhancements. So very powerful Class D amplifiers, network control, Dante options. And we put all of these together in various flavors. So starting from a little 2-amp counter loop unit, medium rooms with our DL107 or a 7-amp unit for perimeter installations, and then our DL207s and 210s for larger spaces or multi-zoned environments. Again, the network control, the capability, one of the things that makes us quite a bit different is we've built in additional DSP controls, or more flexibility in the DSP that we offer. And where that really comes into play is when you're compensating or trying to overcome obstacles like metal loss and other forms of interference. The more control that you have over the DSP, the more likely you are to provide a nice clean sound. So we put all that into one very affordable package for the venue. And as always, we make it lucrative for our authorized resellers to make it worth their time, not only for the install services, but in nice healthy margins for the product itself. We've, I think, addressed some of Danielle's questions about other locations for wire. Here's a good question. Do you have an agreement drafted for the carpet folks to sign with your client? So yeah, this individual is saying, I think it's Romy, has built terminology into the quote. However, always have an issue in getting paid on the back end for your time to repair wire that the carpet or the flooring people hit. So have either of you built in any kind of language, or would you recommend that?
We've built in the language to the contract to hold the client responsible for additional costs. They never know, that trickles down too far with the flooring people. So it usually ends with the client. Sometimes we can have it end with the builder. But as long as we keep everyone involved throughout the entire process, then we try and show our best practice being there and trying to help as much as possible. We've never had any issues with getting reimbursed for our time with damage, because it's usually caught right away during the installation of whatever the flooring is.
Got it. I'll throw one more thing out here. Joseph, thanks for putting in your comments here. It says, Joseph shared that he found that saw cut installation is preferable to his team if it can be achieved, and asking if we offer a direct burial cable and what's recommended for the saw cut. So I'm going to refer to our design guide here in a minute, but if that is an option, it certainly adds some time and expense compared to flat copper going under carpet. But if you can saw cut in, lay direct burial cable in that saw cut, and then put some kind of a coating over it that doesn't interfere, that can be a great way to do it, and a lot less likely to have that wire or the phased array pattern disturbed in the course of the install. So I'm going to, Tommy, real quick here as I hand it back to you, if okay, I'm just going to share my screen momentarily. And what I wanted to do is put in, again, a big thank you for my guests today. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to share your experience. We put some contact information on the screen if you have a need to reach out to either of these guys for their expertise or subcontracting. Down in the corner here, we'd encourage you to download our free guide. So this has many of the best practices that were covered today, as well as some checklists, things that you can use or contact our Tech Blue team at techblue@williamsav.com. We have a lot of online resources within our website as well. So visit us at williamsav.com to take on a lot of these resources that can help you to deploy loops and make a difference by following all these best practices. I will, in just a moment here, as Tommy wraps up, put this link down here on how to get the guide into the chat. So thank you, Tommy. I'll kick it back to you.
Well, guys, we can't thank you enough. Tony, Richard, Sydney, and everyone at Williams AV, thanks for being with us today. It takes a lot of effort to put one of these webinars together. We do so many of them. I really appreciate your approach, by bringing your experts to the meetings. It brings that emotional connection and that effective learning experience that we're all looking for, because, it's where the rubber meets the road. This is the real deal here. And I appreciate your approach to doing it that way.
Thank you.
For those in our audience that aren't familiar with PSNI, go to the PSNI website at psni.org. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and someone will reach out to you and guide you in the right direction. For our companies that are in PSNI that are in our meeting today, all of the details of our program with Williams AV, all of their contact information is listed on the member portal. So if you need any help other than that, you can always reach out to me. That's T Roberts. That's for Tom Roberts at psni.org. Tony, before we close, anything else you'd like to say?
No, just take advantage of the resources that are available to you. Sometimes we hear that, boy, loops are really involved and there's a lot of variables, but once you get the first few done and you understand the difference and the considerations, they're no more complex than a lot of the other things that we do as designers to create a great experience. So tap into to those resources that are available to you, and we do those designs into a lot of spaces as a courtesy to earn your business. So please use those resources, and thanks again for the opportunity today.
Well, you're more than welcome, guys. Thank you again. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to be with us. The meeting today was recorded, and our link will be provided to you. Due to time, on behalf of the PSNI Global Alliance, we want to thank everyone for being with us today. Have a wonderful rest of the year. Stay safe, and goodbye.